Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Divorce laws, social impacts, and historical precedents vary significantly by jurisdiction and individual circumstance. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal professionals or licensed counselors regarding their specific situations. Imagine a time in America where your marital status wasn't just a personal choice, but a matter of state security, religious salvation, and literal survival. In the mid-17th century, specifically the year 1661, the concept of ending a marriage wasn't just a social taboo. It was often a legal impossibility that could lead to public shaming, loss of property, or even imprisonment. Today, we view the dissolution of a marriage as a standard legal procedure, but 3.5 centuries ago, the battle for the right to walk away was just beginning to shape the very foundations of the American identity. We often think of the 1960s as the era of the divorce revolution, but the real tectonic shifts began in the 1660s. By understanding the origins of American marital law, you will finally see the invisible strings that still control our modern legal system, our property rights, and the way we view domestic partnerships today. We are going to deconstruct the myths of the past to explain why your personal freedom looks the way it does in the present. To understand the year 1661, we must first look at the landscape of the American colonies. This was a period of intense transition. The colonies were not a monolith. They were a patchwork of competing ideologies. In the North, the Puritans of New England were establishing a society where the family was the little commonwealth. In the South, particularly in Virginia, the Anglican Church and the English common law held a much tighter, more restrictive grip. The year 1661 is pivotal because it marks a moment of stabilization and codification. This was the era of the Cavalier Parliament in England, which had a direct ripple effect on how the American colonies structured their domestic lives. In 1661, the legal doctrine of coverture was the absolute law of the land. Under coverture, a woman's legal identity was literally subsumed into that of her husband. She could not own property, sign contracts, or sue for any grievance independently. This creates a massive historical paradox. If you cannot exist legally as an individual, how can you possibly sue for a divorce? The answer lies in the absolute versus limited divide. In the mid-17th century, there was almost no such thing as an absolute divorce, what we call divorce of vinculo matrimoniae. Instead, the lucky few who could afford it might seek a divorce from bed and board, or divorce a mensa thera. This didn't actually end the marriage. It was a legal separation that allowed the parties to live apart, but forbade them from ever remarrying. Let's look at a case study from the mid-1600s to see how high the stakes were. Consider the case of a woman in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who faced a husband who had deserted her for years. Under the strict Puritan codes, marriage was a civil contract, not a religious sacrament, a radical departure from English law at the time. Because they viewed it as a contract, they believed it could be broken if one party failed to uphold their end. However, the burden of proof was astronomical. You couldn't just cite irreconcilable differences. You had to prove extreme cruelty, long-term desertion, or bigamy. If you failed to prove your case, you were often ordered by the court to return to your spouse and live together as man and wife, regardless of the animosity or danger involved. The reason 1661 is such a critical benchmark is that it represents the height of the moral police era. In the colonies during this decade, your neighbors weren't just neighbors. They were the primary witnesses for the court. Because there were no private detectives or digital footprints, the community acted as the surveillance state. If a man was seen leaving his house at an odd hour, or if a woman was heard shouting at her husband, the local magistrates would hear about it. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. The records from 1661 show a society obsessed with maintaining the family unit at all costs because the family was the primary unit of economic production. If a marriage failed, the state often had to step in to provide for the abandoned party, and the 17th century taxpayer was even more averse to social spending than people are today. Furthermore, we have to address the 661 context. The specific legal statutes being drafted in the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Massachusetts General Court during this time frame. These statutes were designed to prevent disorderly persons from breaking the social fabric. In 1661, the laws regarding servants and slaves were also being codified, and these intersected with marriage laws in ways that still haunt the American legal system. For example, the legal status of children. whether they were legitimate or illegitimate, determined their entire future, their right to inherit land, and their standing in the church. A divorce was not just a breakup. It was a legal event that could potentially bastardize children and strip them of their entire future. As we dive deeper into this masterclass, we will explore the three specific pillars that kept the 1661 marriage system in place: the economic pillar, the religious pillar, and the gender pillar. The economic pillar was perhaps the most rigid. In an agrarian society, land was everything. Marriage was the primary vehicle for the transfer and consolidation of land. When a man and woman married in 1661, their families were often engaging in a merger. A divorce was therefore a breach of a commercial merger. To undo a marriage was to throw land titles into chaos. We see cases in the 1660s where the court would refuse a divorce simply because they couldn't figure out how to divide the livestock or the acreage without ruining the farm's productivity. The religious pillar focused on the sanctity of the covenant. Even in Puritan New England, where marriage was a civil contract, the religious implications were heavy. Marriage was seen as a reflection of the relationship between Christ and the church. To break that bond was to invite providential wrath upon the entire community. This is why public confessions were so common. If you wanted a separation, you often had to stand before the congregation and admit your failings in gruesome detail. Finally, the gender pillar was the most lopsided. While a man could occasionally secure a divorce for adultery, a woman often had to prove aggravated adultery, meaning the man had to be living openly with another woman or treating the wife with such unbearable cruelty that her life was in immediate danger. Even then, the double standard was written into the very ink of the law. In this series, we are going to trace the evolution from these 1661 restrictions to the modern no-fault era. You will see how the struggles of those colonial ancestors, who risked everything for the right to be free from a toxic union, eventually led to the freedoms we take for granted. We will analyze how the 1661 laws influenced the Founding Fathers, how the frontier changed the rules of the game, and why the American dream is fundamentally tied to the right to start over. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a roadmap of the American heart and the American legal machine. By the end of this 10-part deep dive, you will understand the cultural DNA of divorce in a way that no textbook has ever dared to explain. You will see why the year 1661 was the spark that eventually ignited the flame of personal autonomy in the United States. Let's look at the specific legal documents from the 1661 era to see exactly what a petition for separation looked like. To truly grasp the gravity of a 1661 legal petition, you have to wipe away every modern concept of a courtroom you have in your head. There were no sleek mahogany tables, no digital recorders, and certainly no expectation of privacy. If you were a colonist in 1661 seeking a separation, you were essentially putting your entire moral character on a public stage for the community to dissect. Let us look at the anatomy of a typical petition from this era, specifically focusing on the language used in the Maryland and Virginia assemblies. These documents were not filed in manila folders. They were often handwritten scrolls, penned in archaic script, and read aloud in a room filled with the very people you saw at the local mill or the Sunday service. The language was intentionally self-deprecating. A petitioner wouldn't start by saying they were unhappy. They would start by declaring their total submission to the crown and the church. They would describe themselves as a humble subject of His Majesty, seeking relief from a situation that was causing a scandal to the neighborhood. This is a crucial detail. The legal system didn't care about your happiness, cared about order. If your marriage was so loud, so violent, or so dysfunctional that it was keeping the neighbors awake or requiring the local constable to intervene every week, you finally had a legal foot in the door. The court wasn't granting you a divorce because they felt sorry for you. They were granting it to stop the public nuisance you had become. Imagine a woman named Elizabeth in 1661 Virginia. Elizabeth's husband has not only squandered their tobacco crop on gambling, but has also been absent for 2 years, reportedly living in a different settlement with another woman. In 2026, Elizabeth would simply file for desertion and move on. But in 1661, Elizabeth has to prove that her husband's absence is a threat to the colony's stability. She has to gather depositions from 3 or 4 neighbors who can swear under oath that they haven't seen the husband, that he hasn't provided for the children, and that Elizabeth is now a potential financial burden on the parish. The step-by-step process for this petition was grueling. First, you had to secure a witness. In a world without forensics, the witness was the gold standard. But here is the catch. If a neighbor testified for Elizabeth, They were essentially accusing a man of a crime against the social order. In a small community, that created blood feuds. Second, the petition had to be presented to the governor and his council. There was no specialized family court. Your divorce was being heard by the same people who were deciding on tax rates, Indian affairs, and criminal hangings. This meant your personal tragedy was often rushed through or ignored entirely in favor of high-state politics. The financial data from this era is equally revealing. Historical trends suggest that the cost of a formal legal separation in the 1660s could exceed the annual income of a small farmer. You had to pay the clerk for the filing, the sheriff for delivering the summons, and if you were wealthy enough, a solicitor to argue the points of common law. For the average person in 1661, a legal divorce was a luxury item. This led to a fascinating and dangerous alternative: the poor man's divorce. Because the legal system was so inaccessible, many people simply walked away. They would move 2 colonies over, change their name, and start a new life. This created a massive problem of bigamy in early America, where men and women would essentially have 2 or 3 families scattered across the eastern seaboard, none of them technically legal in the eyes of the church, but all of them functioning as domestic units. Now let's look at the specific 1661 statutes regarding unlawful cohabitation. In that year, the authorities were cracking down on people who were living together without a formal marriage, or those who had separated without court permission. If the court caught Elizabeth living with a new partner before her petition was officially granted, a process that could take years, she could be sentenced to a public whipping. This wasn't a metaphor. The records from the mid-17th century show hundreds of instances where women were whipped at the post for bastardy or lewd behavior, because they had tried to start a new life while their legal petition was still gathering dust in a governor's office. But why was the state so obsessed with the paperwork? Case studies from 1661 show that it always came back to the succession of labor. If a man died without a clear, legally recognized wife, the state didn't know who owned the land or the indentured servants working that land. The colony's economy was built on the stability of these small domestic corporations. If a divorce happened, that corporation was liquidated. The state had to decide who kept the plow, who kept the cow, and who kept the children. Speaking of children, the concept of custody in 1661 would be unrecognizable to a parent in 2026. Under English common law, which the colonies were strictly enforcing in the 1660s, children were considered the legal property of the father. If a divorce or separation occurred, the father almost always retained the children. A mother's tender years doctrine, which suggests young children should stay with their mother, didn't exist yet. In 1661, if Elizabeth successfully petitioned to leave her abusive husband, she often had to walk away with nothing but the clothes on her back, leaving her children behind to be raised by the very man she was fleeing. This was the ultimate deterrent. It wasn't just the social shame. It was the biological and emotional ransom the state held over women to keep them in failing marriages. We also have to look at the influence of the restoration of the British monarchy. In 1660, Charles II was restored to the throne, and by 1661, his administration was sending orders to the colonies to bring their laws into stricter alignment with the Church of England. This meant that the relatively liberal divorce ideas of the early Puritans were being threatened by a more rigid, royalist interpretation of marriage as an indissoluble bond. The 1661 laws were a battleground between the local American reality of harsh frontier life, where people needed to be able to move on and survive, and the distant, formal requirements of a king who wanted a tidy, obedient population. The records also reveal a high-stakes dynamic involving the selectmen, or burgesses. These men were the judge, jury, and executioners of your domestic fate. In one 1661 case study from New England, a man was denied a separation because the court ruled that his spiritual growth would be better served by suffering through a difficult marriage than by being released from it. They viewed a bad marriage as a cross to bear, a divine test of character. If you wanted out, you weren't just fighting your spouse, you were fighting the theological assumption that your suffering was good for your soul. Step by step, the walls were closing in on the 17th century family. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building. People were starting to realize that if the government could dictate the most intimate details of their bedrooms and their kitchens, then the promise of New World liberty was a facade. The petitions of 1661 are the first tremors of a massive cultural earthquake. They show us a population that was starting to demand that their personal happiness and safety be weighted more heavily than the cold, mechanical needs of the state. But what happened when a petition was actually granted? What did it look like when the bond was finally snapped? You might think it was a moment of celebration, but for many it was the start of a whole new kind of nightmare. In the next part, we are going to look at the social death that followed a 1661 divorce. We will explore how the mark of a divorced person turned you into a ghost in your own town, and why the specific legal language used in the 1661 verdicts created a permanent class of social outcasts that would take another 100 years to disappear. You will see why getting what you wanted was often more dangerous than staying in the prison of a broken marriage. The social death that followed a legal decree in 1661 was not a metaphorical concept. It was a total erasure of your standing in the colonial hierarchy. Imagine if today, in 2026, a court order not only ended your marriage but also disabled your social media, blocked your bank accounts, and prohibited your neighbors from speaking to you in the grocery store. This was the reality for the 17th century divorcee. In a society where your identity was tied to your role within a household, being a man or woman without a home was like being a ghost. You were a person without a place in the order of the universe. The first step in this social death was the loss of the credit network. In 1661, there were no credit cards or digital scores. Credit was literally your reputation. Most transactions were based on book debt, a ledger kept by the local merchant. If a woman had successfully petitioned for a separation from bed and board, she was no longer covered by her husband's credit. But because she remained a married woman under the law of coverture, she still could not legally enter into contracts on her own. This created a legal black hole. She could not buy flour on credit because she had no husband to guarantee the debt, and she had no legal standing to guarantee it herself. Historical trends show that many women who achieved legal separation in this era were forced into extreme poverty or domestic service within weeks, simply because the economic infrastructure had no category for a single, separated woman. Consider a case study of a man named Thomas from the Connecticut colony around 1661. Thomas was granted a separation after proving his wife had committed adultery. While Thomas kept the house and the land, he discovered that the social cost was immense. In a community where child-rearing and domestic production were strictly gendered, a man alone was viewed with deep suspicion. He was seen as a failing patriarch. Without a wife to manage the kitchen, the garden, and the spinning, his farm's productivity plummeted. More importantly, the church elders would keep a constant, suffocating watch on his home. Any woman entering his house to help with labor was a potential source of scandal. Thomas wasn't just a bachelor, he was a broken unit. He was often excluded from the informal networks where men discussed town business or land deals, because his domestic failure suggested a lack of discipline and leadership. The psychological toll of being a social outcast was codified through the practice of shaming. In 1661, the law didn't just stop at the courtroom door. If you were the guilty party in a separation, meaning you were the one whose behavior caused the split, the court could order you to wear specific clothing or sit in the stocks. We see records of individuals forced to stand on a stool in the center of the town square during a market day, with a sign pinned to their chest detailing their domestic sins. This was designed to ensure that the social death was visible. It warned potential future partners and employers that this individual was a contract breaker. In an era where the word was your bond, being labeled a contract breaker in the most sacred of all contracts was a professional and social death sentence. Furthermore, we must look at the geography of the outcast. Because the colonies were so small, you couldn't just move to the other side of town to avoid the stares. If you lived in a village of 200 people, everyone knew the details of your petition. They knew the testimony your neighbors had given. They knew about the shouting matches or the neglect. This led to the phenomenon of warning out. In the next part, we are going to look at the resistance of the pews. We will explore how ordinary people began to sabotage the 1661 laws from the inside. You will see how juries began to refuse to convict people for adultery, how neighbors began to lie to protect abused wives, and how the first cracks in the indissoluble bond were actually made by the very people who were supposed to be enforcing it. We are going to look at the secret history of colonial solidarity and how it paved the way for the legal revolts of the 18th century. You will learn why the 1661 system of social death ultimately failed because it underestimated the power of human empathy. The resistance of the pews was the first real sign that the legal rigidity of 1661 was out of touch with the human reality on the ground. To understand this, imagine if in 2026, the government passed a law that was so fundamentally detached from common sense that the average person simply refused to report their neighbors for breaking it. This is exactly what began to happen in the mid-17th century. While the statutes written in 1661 demanded strict adherence to marital unity, the people sitting in the church pews every Sunday, the very people meant to be the eyes and ears of the state, started practicing a form of quiet communal nullification. Historical trends during this decade show a fascinating shift in how local juries and church committees handled domestic disputes. In the early 1600s, a neighbor might have been quick to report a husband's infidelity or a wife's abandonment. But by 1661, a sense of collective exhaustion had set in. The colonists realized that when a family was destroyed by the state, the whole community suffered. If a man was whipped and imprisoned for domestic strife, his fields went fallow, and the town's food supply dwindled. If a woman was cast out as a social ghost, the town had to figure out how to keep her from starving. The community began to prioritize stability over the letter of the law. Case studies from the 1660s reveal the emergence of the selective witness. In several court records from the Virginia colony, we see instances where the court summoned neighbors to testify about a known case of bigamy or desertion. One by one, the neighbors would take the stand and provide remarkably vague testimonies. They would say they had not noticed anyone missing, or they would claim that a known paramour was actually just a distant cousin helping with the harvest. This wasn't because they were confused, it was a deliberate strategy of silence. By refusing to provide the evidence required by the 1661 codes, the community was essentially granting a de facto divorce that the state refused to recognize de jure. Let us look at a character named Sarah from a coastal settlement in 1661. Sarah's husband was notoriously violent, a fact known to everyone within a 5-mile radius. Under the strict laws of the time, Sarah had almost no hope of a legal separation unless her life was in immediate, provable peril. However, the local community took a different approach. Instead of waiting for a court order, the local men might pay the husband a visit, a practice that would later evolve into chivalry or skimmington. They would make it clear that his behavior was no longer tolerated. Simultaneously, the women of the village would provide Sarah with secret resources, food, and emotional support, effectively allowing her to live a separate life while maintaining the outward veneer of a married woman to satisfy the magistrates. This was the Underground Railroad of 17th-century domesticity. This internal sabotage also extended to the jury box. In 1661, most legal matters, including the criminal aspects of adultery and desertion, were decided by a jury of one's peers. We begin to see a rise in the not guilty verdict for crimes that were clearly committed. A jury of local farmers in 1661 would look at a man accused of leaving his wife and realize that if they convicted him, they were setting a precedent that could be used against them or their sons. They began to interpret the 1661 laws with a sudden localized leniency. They would find that while the man had left, he had not technically deserted because he had left behind a bushel of corn and an old spade, which they argued constituted a provision for the family. These were legal fictions used to protect people from the draconian outcomes of the state's mandates. The data behind this movement is found in the gaps of the official record. When we compare the number of known domestic scandals mentioned in private diaries and letters to the number of actual court cases prosecuted in 1661, there is a massive discrepancy. The law was a lion, but it was a lion without teeth because the people refused to feed it. This period marks the beginning of the American tradition of localism, the belief that the people living in a community know better how to manage their lives than a distant governor or a king across the ocean. Imagine if you were a local magistrate in 1661, tasked with enforcing these laws. You are caught in a pincer movement. On one side, you have the new mandates from the Restoration in England demanding that you crack down on moral laxity. On the other side, you have your own neighbors, friends, and family members who are looking at you with silent defiance. This pressure led many magistrates to simply stop looking for trouble. They would only prosecute a divorce or a separation if it was handed to them on a silver platter with no other choice. This created a period of benign neglect, where as long as you weren't public about your separation, the law would look the other way. Step by step, the 1661 system was being eroded by human empathy. People saw the misery of their friends and decided that the law was wrong. This was a radical shift. In a world where laws were seen as divine and unchangeable, the 1660s introduced the idea that a law that produces only misery and social decay is a bad law. This sentiment didn't lead to a revolution overnight, but it laid the intellectual groundwork for the idea of personal liberty. Furthermore, we must consider the role of the meddling aunt, or the local midwife, as the unofficial lawyers of the 1661 era. These women were the keepers of the community's secrets. They knew which marriages were shams and which separations were necessary for survival. Because midwives were often the only people allowed into the private spaces of a home during times of crisis, they held immense power. We find case studies where a midwife's testimony was the only thing that could sway a court in 1661. If she testified that a husband's cruelty had caused a miscarriage, even the most rigid judge had to listen. These women became the navigators of the 1661 legal maze, advising younger women on how to frame their grievances to get the best potential outcomes from an unfriendly system. This communal resistance was not without its risks. If the state caught wind that a whole village was conspiring to hide a separation or a bigamous marriage, the consequences could be collective fines or the suspension of the town's charter. The stakes were incredibly high. The Great Colonial Loophole was the first instance of a two-tiered legal system in American domestic life. In 1661, while the average farmer or blacksmith was trapped in a social and legal cage, the elite, the landed gentry, the merchant princes, and the politically connected, began to realize that the law was a wall with many hidden doors. If you had the capital and the connections, you didn't need the permission of a local magistrate or a church elder. You could essentially buy your way into a new life through the use of private equity contracts and trust-like arrangements. This created a profound irony. The very people who wrote the strict moral laws of 1661 for the masses were often the ones most skilled at circumventing them for themselves. The primary tool for this elite escape was the Private Bill of Separation. In 1661, there was a distinction between a common court case and a legislative act. A wealthy man could petition the colonial assembly directly, bypassing the local courts entirely. This wasn't a trial, it was a political negotiation. Because these assemblies were often made up of business partners and social peers, a wealthy petitioner could secure a private bill that granted them rights that were technically illegal for everyone else. These bills often included the right to remarry, and the right to transfer property outside of the standard rules of coverture. Imagine a character named William, a wealthy tobacco merchant in 1661 Virginia. William's marriage was a disaster, but his wealth was tied up in land and shipping interests. If William went through a standard court, he risked a public scandal that would tank his business reputation and potentially lead to a seizure of his assets by the state. Instead, William utilizes his connections in the House of Burgesses. He invites the key decision-makers to his estate, provides a lavish dinner, and discusses the potential outcomes of a private settlement. A bill is drafted that quietly separates William from his wife, provides her with a trust for her maintenance to keep her from being a public charge, and allows William to continue his business as a free agent. This was 2026-level legal maneuvering, happening in a 1661 world. But what about the women of this elite class? While the loophole was primarily a male tool, wealthy women occasionally used marriage settlements or prenuptial trusts to create a buffer. In 1661, these were rare and legally precarious, but they existed. A wealthy father, wanting to protect his daughter from a fortune-hunting husband, would place her dowry in a separate trust managed by her brothers or uncles. If the marriage failed, this trust ensured that the woman had independent financial support. This didn't give her a divorce in the eyes of the law, but it gave her the power of the purse. With enough money, a woman in 1661 could move to a separate estate, live an independent life, and ignore the husband who technically owned her legal identity. This was the birth of the social divorce, where the marriage existed on paper but nowhere else. Historical trends show that this economic divide created a sense of growing resentment among the middle and lower classes. The average person saw that the laws of 1661 were only as firm as your bank balance was small. This led to the rise of sham separations among the less wealthy, who tried to mimic the elite's private contracts without the legal authority to back them up. They would write out their own divorce papers on a piece of parchment, sign them in front of a few friends at a tavern, and believe they were free. Of course, the moment they tried to remarry or sell land, the state would step in and crush them. The 1661 system was designed to keep the power concentrated, and these informal attempts at freedom were treated as criminal acts of forgery and bigamy. Let's look at the step-by-step details of how a wealthy family would engineer a separation in 1661. First, they would create a narrative of illness or necessary travel. The husband or wife would move to a distant plantation or even back to England for a year. This cooling-off period allowed the social scandal to subside. Second, a deed of separation was drafted. This was a private contract between the husband and the wife's male relatives. In this deed, the husband would agree not to interfere with the wife's life, and to pay a specific amount for her support. in exchange for her family not suing him for abandonment or cruelty. Third, they would maintain a facade of respectability. They would continue to correspond and occasionally appear in public together, even if they hadn't shared a roof in a decade. This was a high-stakes game of legal chicken. If the church ever caught wind that the deed of separation was a replacement for a holy union, they could excommunicate the entire family. But in 1661, even the church was susceptible to the influence of the wealthy. The tithes paid by a large plantation owner could often buy a lot of pastoral silence. This created a shadow economy of marriage where the rules were written in ink for the poor and in pencil for the rich. Case studies from this era illustrate that the 1661 loophole wasn't just about avoiding a bad spouse, it was about protecting the dynasty. In one specific Maryland case, a separation was granted via a private legislative act because the alternative, a public trial for adultery, would have revealed that the children of the marriage were not the legal heirs. To protect the land title and the purity of the lineage, the government allowed a quiet private exit. This shows that in 1661, the law was more concerned with the orderly transfer of property than with the moral conduct of its citizens. This economic disparity is the missing link in our understanding of American divorce history. We often talk about the moral or religious reasons for the change, but the real driver was the fundamental unfairness of the 1661 loophole. As the merchant class grew, more people wanted access to the same private exits that the elite possessed. The demand for divorce for all was, in many ways, a demand for equity for all. People began to ask why a tobacco baron could walk away from a toxic marriage with his dignity and his land intact, while a small-scale farmer was forced to stay and suffer. Imagine if in 2026, only the top 1% of earners could legally end a marriage, while everyone else was forced to stay together under threat of jail time. You can visualize the social explosion that would cause. That explosion was simmering in 1661. The loophole didn't just provide an escape, it provided a target. It gave the reformers of the next generation a specific grievance to rally around. They didn't just want to change the law, they wanted to dismantle the privilege that allowed the wealthy to ignore the law. The 1661 loophole also changed the way property was viewed in America. Because people were trying to hide assets during separations, they began to develop more complex ways of holding land and money. This era saw the early development of what we now call separate property and community property concepts, though they wouldn't be fully realized for centuries. Every time a 1661 lawyer drafted a secret deed to protect a separated woman's inheritance, they were laying a brick in the foundation of modern family law. But as the 1660s came to a close, a new threat to this delicate balance emerged. It wasn't the lawyers or the merchants, but a shift in the very nature of the American population. The New World was becoming less English and more diverse, and the old 1661 codes were starting to clash with the customs of people who didn't care about the House of Burgesses or the Church of England. In the next part, we are going to dive into the frontier renegades. We will explore how the American wilderness became the ultimate divorce court. You will see how people used the vast, unmapped forests of the 1660s to perform self-divorce, and why the authorities were terrified of the marriage of the woods. We will look at how the 1661 laws finally met an enemy they couldn't control: the sheer scale of the American continent. This is where the story turns from a legal drama into an epic struggle for survival and identity. The frontier was not just a geographic boundary. In 1661, it was a legal vacuum that swallowed the mandates of the crown and the church whole. To understand the frontier renegades, you have to realize that the further a colonist moved from the coastal ports of Boston, Jamestown, or St. Mary's City, the more the 1661 statutes began to dissolve. In the deep woods and the untamed Appalachian foothills, there were no judges, no town criers, and no sheriff's deputies to enforce the rules of coverture or the sanctity of the indissoluble bond. This created a phenomenon known as the marriage of the woods, a radical form of self-divorce and repartnering that horrified the colonial establishment because it proved that, given the choice, people would choose personal autonomy over state-mandated misery. Imagine a character named Elias in 1661. Elias is a frontiersman who has spent 3 years trying to make a life in a remote clearing near the edge of the colonial frontier. Back in the settled town of Ipswich, he has a wife he hasn't seen in half a decade, a marriage that was broken by poverty and mutual resentment long before he headed west. Under the 1661 laws, Elias is technically a deserter and a criminal. But on the frontier, Elias meets a woman named Martha who is also fleeing a catastrophic past. Without a minister or a magistrate within a 3-day ride, They simply declare themselves married. They don't file a petition. They don't seek a private bill. They perform a self-divorce from their pasts by the sheer act of physical distance and communal recognition. This was the ultimate threat to the 1661 system because it was scalable. As more people moved west to escape the high taxes and rigid social structures of the coast, the number of self-divorced individuals skyrocketed. The authorities in 1661 viewed these frontier settlements as dens of iniquity, but for the people living there, it was a necessary survival strategy. In the wilderness, a household could not function with a missing spouse or a paralyzed legal status. You needed a partner to survive the winter, to defend the homestead, and to raise the next generation of laborers. The frontier forced a pragmatic rewrite of the law. If the state cannot provide a legal exit, the individual will create one. Historical trends during this era show that the colonial governments tried to fight back with the Vagrancy Acts of 1661. These laws were specifically designed to track people moving between settlements. If you arrived in a new area without a certificate of good standing from your previous parish, you could be arrested as a runaway. However, the American continent was simply too large. For every one person the constables caught, 100 disappeared into the forest. This led to a fascinating legal stalemate. The 1661 laws remained on the books in the cities, but in the backcountry, a new informal common law was taking root, one that prioritized functional partnerships over legal purity. Case studies from the 1661 Maryland borderlands describe a practice called wife-selling, which, despite its horrific name, was often a ritualized form of mutual consent divorce among the poor who couldn't afford the 1661 loophole. A husband would bring his wife to a public space with a halter around her neck, and a prearranged buyer, often her new partner, would purchase her for a nominal fee like a shilling or a mug of ale. While this was technically illegal and viewed as a barbaric holdover from medieval English customs, it was a way for the community to witness and legitimize a separation and a new union. It was a public performance that said, "This contract is over and a new one has begun." The 1661 magistrates tried to suppress this, but it persisted because it solved a social problem that the formal legal system refused to address. Step by step, the frontier was stripping the 1661 laws of their moral authority. When a self-divorced couple on the frontier became successful, respectable members of their new community, it undermined the argument that divorce led to social ruin. These renegades were building churches, clearing land, and raising families. They were the backbone of the expanding colonies. If the 1661 laws said they were sinners and outcasts, but their reality showed they were productive and stable, the law began to look like the problem, not the people. This is the moment where the American character begins to associate the pursuit of happiness with the right to move on from a mistake. The data from the 1660s also highlights the gendered flight. While we often think of men running to the frontier, many women use the chaos of the expanding borders to escape abusive situations. A woman in 1661, who could reach a distant settlement where she wasn't known, could reinvent herself as a widow. By claiming her husband had died at sea or in a distant conflict, she could regain her legal identity, own property, and eventually remarry. This widowhood by proxy was a common tactic. It was a lie, but it was a lie that the frontier made possible. It was a form of divorce where the state was simply cut out of the loop entirely. But there was a dark side to this frontier freedom. Without the 1661 laws to provide a framework for the division of assets or the protection of children, these marriages of the woods were often precarious. If a man decided to self-divorce for a second or third time, the woman he left behind had no legal recourse. She couldn't sue for maintenance because their union didn't officially exist. This created a cycle of abandonment that the 1661 laws were originally intended to prevent. The tragedy of the 1660s was that by making legal divorce impossible, the state forced people into a lawless environment where the most vulnerable, usually women and children, had no protection at all. Imagine if in 2026, you had to choose between staying in a toxic home or moving to a place where the law didn't exist. That was the choice for thousands of Americans in 1661. It explains why the American legal system eventually had to bend. The magistrates realized that if they didn't provide a regulated, legal way to end a marriage, they would lose control of the population entirely. The frontier was the pressure cooker that eventually forced the legal reforms of the following century. In this deep dive, we have seen how the 1661 laws were attacked from the top by the wealthy and from the edges by the pioneers. The system was being squeezed. But there was one final pillar holding the 1661 structure in place: the fear of the divine. Even the most hardened frontiersman or the most cynical tobacco merchant feared for their soul. To truly change the culture of divorce, someone had to change the way people thought about God's view of marriage. In the next part, we are going to look at the theological rebellion. We will explore the radical 1661 sermons that began to suggest that God actually hated a miserable marriage more than he hated a divorce. We will analyze the secret writings of rogue ministers who argued that forcing two people to live in hatred was a form of spiritual slow-motion suicide. You will see how the language of the pulpit shifted from endurance to liberation, and why this religious pivot was the most dangerous threat of all to the 1661 establishment. This was the battle for the American soul, and the outcome would determine the future of every household in the colonies. The theological rebellion of the 1660s was the intellectual crowbar that began to prying the state's fingers off the American throat. To understand why this was so radical, you have to realize that in 1661, the church and the law were not two separate entities, they were a single suffocating fabric. A divorce wasn't just a legal breach, it was considered an act of cosmic treason. However, a quiet but fierce intellectual movement began to emerge from the pulpits of smaller, more radical congregations. These rogue ministers began to look at the Greek and Hebrew origins of biblical texts to find a loophole that could save their parishioners from the living hell of a broken home. They were no longer preaching that you had to suffer in silence to prove your holiness. They were starting to argue that a house built on hatred was an affront to God himself. Imagine a small meeting house in 1661, filled with the smell of damp wool and wood smoke. A minister named Samuel stands before his congregation. In the back row there is a woman whose husband has been publicly unfaithful and physically abusive for a decade. Under the standard 1661 interpretation, Samuel is supposed to tell her that her suffering is a sanctifying fire. But instead, Samuel cites the concept of the hardness of heart. He argues that marriage is a type of the union between Christ and the church, and if that union is characterized by cruelty and betrayal, it is no longer a marriage, it is a blasphemous imitation. By redefining what a marriage actually was, these ministers were essentially saying that the divorce had already happened in the eyes of God, and the court was simply lagging behind the spiritual reality. This was a massive shift in historical trends. For centuries, the dominant view was that marriage was an indissoluble sacrament, but the American experience in 1661 was forcing a move toward the contractual view. If a marriage was a contract, and one party committed a material breach, the other party was released from their obligations. This sounds like modern 2026 legal logic, but in 1661 it was heresy. These ministers were using case studies of ancient Israelites and early Christian martyrs to justify the idea that peace in the home was a prerequisite for a relationship with the divine. They began to preach that a man who could not love his wife was unfit for the communion table, and a woman who was being destroyed by her husband was permitted to flee for the sake of her soul's preservation. The data from this period shows a spike in church disciplinary records that don't end in excommunication. Usually, if you left your spouse in 1661, you were cast out of the church. But in the mid-1660s, we see instances where church councils actually sided with the departing spouse. They would record that the marriage had been dissolved by the wicked conduct of the husband, and therefore the wife was free to live apart in good standing. This created a legal crisis. If the church said you were free, but the state said you were still married, who had the final authority? This friction is what eventually led to the American concept of the separation of church and state, but in 1661 it was just a chaotic, overlapping mess of jurisdictions. Step by step, the language of the pulpit began to sanitize the idea of separation. They stopped using words like desertion and started using words like deliverance. They stopped focusing on the sin of the one who left and started focusing on the sin of the one who made the home unlivable. Consider the intellectual influence of John Milton, whose pamphlets on divorce were making their way into the hands of literate colonists. Milton argued that a lack of intellectual and emotional companionship was a greater reason for divorce than even physical adultery. While his ideas were officially banned in many places, they were being discussed in secret by the educated elite and the radical clergy. They were planting the seeds of the idea that marriage was about more than just land and labor. It was about the mind and the heart. Imagine if in 2026, a major shift in public philosophy suddenly made all your previous contracts void because the spirit of the agreement had vanished. That is the level of disruption we are talking about. The 1661 establishment was terrified because if the religious justification for marriage fell, the entire social hierarchy would follow. If a woman could leave her husband because he was cruel, Could a citizen leave a king who was a tyrant? The link between the domestic household and the political state was absolute. A divorce in a 1661 cottage was seen as the first step toward a revolution in the palace. We see this play out in the specific case study of a community in the Rhode Island colony, which was already a haven for religious outcasts. There, the local records from 1661 reflect a much higher rate of sanctioned separations than in the more rigid Virginia or Massachusetts colonies. The Rhode Island ministers argued that the conscience was supreme. If a person's conscience told them that staying in a marriage was a sin against their own humanity, the community supported their exit. This was the first liberatory model of divorce in America, and it was entirely driven by this theological rebellion. However, the 1661 legal codes tried to strike back by imposing the doctrine of recrimination. This was a legal trap where if both parties were found to have committed a fault, say the husband was abusive but the wife had once spoken disrespectfully of him in public, the court would refuse the divorce and force them to stay together as a punishment for their mutual sin. The theologians of the rebellion began to attack this doctrine specifically. They called it the gallows of marriage, arguing that forcing two people to torment each other for the rest of their lives was not a divine punishment but a demonic one. This religious pivot also changed the way children were viewed in the context of a split. Instead of seeing children as property that must remain with the father to maintain the lineage, radical ministers began to suggest that the spiritual welfare of the child was paramount. If a father was a drunkard or a profligate, it was better for the child to be raised by a pious, separated mother. This was the very first time the best interests of the child started to peek through the cracks of the law, although it would take another 200 years to become the standard. By the end of 1661, the theological landscape of America was no longer a solid block of ice. It was a river beginning to crack and flow. The idea of the holy divorce was no longer an oxymoron. It was a debated, discussed, and increasingly utilized concept. The power of the indissoluble bond was being replaced by the power of the godly conscience. This shift meant that the state could no longer rely on the threat of eternal damnation to keep unhappy couples together. The fear was being replaced by a hope for a new beginning, a very American sentiment that would eventually define the nation's identity. But as the religious barriers fell, the state realized it needed a new way to keep track of its citizens. If they couldn't control people's souls, they would have to control their bodies and their names. This led to a massive increase in the bureaucracy of marriage, the very first iterations of the marriage license and the formal registration of domestic status. In the next part, we are going to look at the paper trail of blood. We will explore how the 1661 authorities began to use the first primitive forms of biometric and identity tracking to stop people from disappearing into new lives. You will see the dark side of the 1660 census, the rise of the first wanted posters for runaway spouses, and the high-stakes game of cat and mouse played between the state's recorders and the people who wanted to be forgotten. You will learn why your modern marriage certificate is actually a descendant of a 17th-century police tactic. The paper trail of blood began as a desperate attempt by the 1661 colonial administration to categorize a population that was becoming increasingly fluid, mobile, and defiant. To understand this, we have to look at the birth of the registry. Before the 1660s, many marriages in the colonies were recorded only in family Bibles or church ledgers. But as the rate of informal separations and frontier desertions climbed, the state realized it was losing its grip on the tax base and the inheritance lines. In 1661, we see the first aggressive push for civil registration, the precursor to our modern marriage license. This wasn't created to celebrate love. It was created as a tracking device. The state needed a permanent central record of who was bound to whom so that they could hunt down those who tried to vanish. Imagine a man named Robert in 1661. Robert has left a difficult marriage in Massachusetts and traveled south to Maryland, hoping to start a new life under a new name. In 2026, a simple background check or a digital footprint would flag Robert instantly. In 1661, the state had to rely on a more physical and brutal form of surveillance. The authorities began to issue physical descriptions in town squares, the first wanted posters for runaway spouses. These descriptions were meticulously detailed, noting scars, the loss of teeth, specific gaits, and the quality of one's speech. If Robert was caught, he wasn't just returned to his wife. He was branded with the letter S for spousal deserter or whipped in the public square. This was the state using the human body as a ledger when the paper ledger failed. The data from the 1661 statutes reveals a fascination with biometric tracking through clothing and branding. There were laws discussed during this period that suggested runaway wives or deserting husbands should be forced to wear specific colors or marks on their garments to signify their status as contract breakers. This was a way of making the paper trail visible on the skin. Every time a person moved to a new parish, they were required to present a testimonial of character from their previous magistrate. If you didn't have this paper, you were legally a non-person. You couldn't buy land, you couldn't trade in the market, and you certainly couldn't remarry. This was an early form of a social credit system, designed specifically to prevent the kind of domestic reinvention that was becoming common on the frontier. Historical trends show that this bureaucracy of domesticity actually backfired. Instead of stopping separations, it created a massive black market for forged documents. We find case studies from 1661 where itinerant scribes would sell fake certificates of widowhood or forged letters of permission from distant magistrates. For a few shillings, a woman could buy a new identity that allowed her to bypass the 1661 restrictions and marry a new partner in a different colony. This led to the first real cat-and-mouse game between the colonial record keepers and the people. The state would introduce a new seal or a specific type of parchment to prevent forgeries, and the forgers would adapt within months. The paper trail was becoming a battlefield where the prize was a person's right to start over. Step by step, the 1661 authorities expanded the census to include the marital status of every inhabitant. This wasn't just for population counting, it was a domestic audit. If a household was found to have a man and woman living together who could not produce a registered certificate, they were hauled before the court for lewd and lascivious carriage. In 1661, the burden of proof was on the couple. You were guilty until you could prove you were legally bound. This created a climate of fear, but it also encouraged a new kind of communal lying. Entire villages would often coordinate their stories to protect a couple who were living in a common law union after a quiet separation from previous spouses. The state's paper trail was only as strong as the people's willingness to tell the truth, and in 1661, the people were learning how to lie to the state with a straight face. Consider the case of a woman named Mary in 1661 Connecticut. Mary had been abandoned by her husband, who took their only cow and disappeared into the New York Territory. Mary was left with 3 children and a farm she could not legally manage because her name wasn't on the deed. When the census taker arrived, Mary had a choice: admit she was a deserted wife and risk having the state seize her farm and put her children into forced apprenticeships, or lie and say her husband was simply away on a long hunting expedition. These census lies are buried in our historical records, creating a false sense of marital stability in 1661 that didn't actually exist. Mary's story shows that the paper trail was often a record of survival strategies, rather than a record of truth. The high-stakes game of identity tracking also involved the hue and cry. This was a legal requirement where if a spouse was reported as a runaway, every citizen in the path of their flight was legally obligated to join the pursuit or face a fine. In 1661, the state was essentially deputizing the entire population to act as a dragnet. But as we've seen in previous parts, the empathy of the pews often meant that the hue and cry was met with a shrug and a pointed finger in the wrong direction. The state was building a massive machine of control, but the gears were being jammed by the very people who were supposed to turn them. This era also saw the rise of the first divorce advertisements, in the form of public notices in colonial newspapers and broadsides. A husband would post a notice stating that his wife had eloped from his bed and board, and that he would no longer be responsible for her debts. This was a defensive move in the paper war. By publishing this, the husband was preemptively cutting off the wife's credit and warning the community that her legal standing was severed. These notices were the 17th century version of a scorched earth legal strategy. They were designed to ensure that the social death we discussed earlier was total and absolute. Imagine if in 2026, your partner could post a single notice on a public forum that instantly froze your ability to survive. That is what these 1661 notices did. They used the power of the printed word to enforce the state's will when the state wasn't physically present. But even this had a loophole. Women began to post counter notices, claiming they hadn't eloped but had been driven away by unbearable cruelty, effectively turning the public broadside into a public trial. This was the first time the American public was invited to judge a marriage through the media. The paper trail wasn't just a record anymore. It was a weapon of public relations. The 1661 paper trail also reveals a dark history of how the state tracked the marriages of the enslaved and the indentured. For these populations, the marriage record was a tool of extreme control. The state would often refuse to record these unions at all, ensuring that families could be broken and sold without legal friction. Yet, we find records of enslaved people creating their own unofficial paper trails, letters, shared tokens, and oral histories that defied the 1661 logic. They were creating a shadow registry that the state could never touch. This reminds us that the history of divorce and marriage in America is always a history of who the state chooses to see and who it chooses to ignore. As the 1660s drew to a close, the sheer volume of these domestic disputes was starting to clog the colonial courts. The paper trail was becoming a mountain that the magistrates couldn't climb. They needed a way to simplify the process without losing control. They needed a compromise. This brings us to a moment of radical legal innovation, the moment when the American legal system began to entertain the idea that maybe, just maybe, the state shouldn't be in the business of forcing people to be miserable. In the next part, we are going to explore the Great 1661 Pivot. You will see how the colonial governors, overwhelmed by the chaos of the paper trail and the frontier renegades, began to draft the first separation allowances. We will look at the secret negotiations between the state and the people that led to the very first versions of alimony and child support. You will learn how the government turned from a moral police force into a financial mediator, and why this shift was the beginning of the end for the old world of divorce. The focus was moving from who sinned to who pays, and that change would rewrite the American social contract forever. The Great 1661 Pivot marked the exact moment when the American legal machine realized it could no longer effectively police the human heart, so it decided instead to police the human wallet. This shift from moral judgment to financial mediation is the true ancestor of our modern family court system. By the late months of 1661, the colonial governors were facing a logistical nightmare. The courts were backlogged with messy, emotional petitions that took years to resolve, and the frontier was hemorrhaging taxpayers who would rather live in the woods than stay in a state-mandated cage. The solution was a cold, pragmatic re-engineering of the law. If the state couldn't force a man and woman to love each other, it would at least force them to remain economically linked so that neither became a ward of the parish. This was the birth of the separation allowance, a concept that evolved into what we recognize in 2026 as alimony and child support. Imagine a merchant named Benjamin in 1661. Benjamin and his wife, Catherine, have reached a state of domestic warfare that is disruptive to their entire coastal village. In the old 1661 model, the court would spend months trying to determine who committed the greater sin, often ending in a stalemate that left both parties trapped. But under the pivot, the magistrate takes a different approach. He looks at Benjamin's ledgers instead of his soul. He determines that Benjamin's business generates a certain amount of profit from the sale of salted fish and timber. The court then issues a decree. Benjamin and Catherine can live in separate houses, but Benjamin must provide a specific portion of his weekly earnings, the first separation allowance, to Catherine. The focus isn't on punishing Benjamin for his temper or Catherine for her defiance. The focus is on ensuring that Catherine doesn't end up on the town's welfare rolls. This was a radical departure from historical trends. For the first time, the state was essentially saying that the financial contract of marriage could survive even if the spiritual and physical union had died. This created a new layer of the paper trail we discussed earlier. Now, instead of just tracking names and faces, the state began to track assets and income with a new level of granularity. They were creating the first primitive version of a domestic financial audit. The records from 1661 show a sudden increase in the use of terms like maintenance and competent provision. These weren't suggestions, they were court-ordered transfers of wealth. If Benjamin failed to pay, the state didn't just pray for his soul, they seized his boat. Step by step, the 1661 magistrates developed a formula for these allowances. It wasn't as sophisticated as a 2026 spreadsheet, but it followed a clear logic. First, they assessed the station of the parties. A merchant's wife was entitled to a different level of maintenance than a laborer's wife. Second, they looked at the fault but only as a multiplier. If Benjamin was the primary aggressor, his maintenance payment was set higher. Third, they considered the presence of children. This is where the concept of child support began to emerge from the shadows of property law. The court started to specify that a portion of the allowance was specifically for the diet and clothing of the offspring. This was the state acknowledging that children had a financial right to their father's labor, regardless of the parents' marital status. Case studies from the Virginia House of Burgesses in late 1661 reveal the first support enforcement mechanisms. We find records of men who tried to flee their maintenance obligations by moving to another county. The governors responded by creating a system of interstate, or rather inter-county debt recognition. They treated a maintenance order like a commercial debt. If Benjamin owed Catherine money in one jurisdiction, that debt followed him to the next. This was the state's way of closing the frontier loophole we explored earlier. You could run from your wife, but in the new 1661 legal reality, it was becoming much harder to run from your debts. This pivot also changed the power dynamics for women. While coverture still technically existed, a woman with a court-ordered separation allowance gained a strange new kind of semi-autonomy. She wasn't fully free, but she had a guaranteed income that her husband could not legally withhold. This led to the rise of the independent female household. In the 1660s, we see a growing number of women who used these allowances to start small businesses, run boarding houses, or manage their own small plots of land. They were the first generation of American women to navigate the world as femme sole in practice, even if they were still femme covert in the strict letter of the law. They were the pioneers of the modern independent divorcee, living on the financial echoes of a dead marriage. However, the 1661 pivot had a dark side for the poor. If you were a laborer with no assets and no steady income, the court had no leverage over you. The separation allowance was a tool for the middle and upper classes. For the lower classes, the state's inability to enforce financial support meant that women and children were often left in absolute destitution. This created a widening gap in the experience of divorce in America. For the wealthy, divorce was becoming a financial negotiation. For the poor, it remained a desperate, dangerous gamble. The 1661 laws were essentially creating two different Americas. One where money could buy a clean break, and one where the lack of it kept you in chains or threw you into the almshouse. Imagine if in 2026, the quality of your post-divorce life was determined entirely by whether you could prove your spouse had a liquid asset. We still see the remnants of this 1661 logic in our modern system, where the enforcement of support is often a game of hide-and-seek with bank accounts. The 1661 magistrates were the ones who first taught the American public that if you wanted to leave, you had to be able to pay for the privilege of the exit. This turned marriage into a high-stakes financial risk, leading many young men and women of the 1660s to delay marriage or seek alternative domestic arrangements that bypassed the state entirely. The data also points to the rise of the negotiated settlement. Because the court's formula for maintenance was so rigid, many couples began to negotiate their own terms before even stepping into the courtroom. They would bring a signed agreement to the magistrate and ask him to simply rubber stamp it. This was the ancestor of the modern settlement agreement. It allowed couples to maintain some control over their lives and avoid the public shaming of a full moral trial. The 1661 pivot was making the legal system more efficient, but it was also making it more transactional. The sacred bond was being replaced by the negotiated payout. As we reach the conclusion of this shift, we see the 1661 legal system standing at a crossroads. It had survived the theological rebellions, the frontier renegades, and the paper wars by evolving into a financial arbiter. But there was one final question that the pivot couldn't answer. If marriage was now a financial contract that could be modified and maintained through payouts, what happened to the concept of the family as the foundation of the state? If people could just pay to leave, was the American family becoming a temporary arrangement rather than a permanent pillar? In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the 1661 legacy. 350 years later, we will explore how these specific archaic laws from the mid-17th century are still written into the code of our 2026 family courts. You will see the direct line from the 1661 separation allowance to your modern tax codes, your custody battles, and the way society views the successful divorce. We will wrap up this deep dive by answering the ultimate question. Did 1661 liberate the American individual, or did it just trade a spiritual cage for a financial one? The final loop is about to close, and what we find there will change the way you look at your own legal identity forever. The legacy of 1661 is not a dusty relic confined to the archives of colonial Virginia or the meeting houses of Massachusetts. It is the living, breathing architecture of the modern American legal system. When you look at a divorce decree in 2026, you are looking at a document that has been 365 years in the making. The core tension we identified at the start of this masterclass, the struggle between state control, communal stability, and individual autonomy, remains the fundamental heartbeat of family law. We have moved from a society that viewed marriage as a permanent religious covenant to one that views it as a civil contract. Yet the echoes of 1661 still dictate who gets the house, who keeps the children, and how much of your future labor belongs to your past. To see the direct line from 1661 to 2026, we must look at the concept of state interest. In 1661, the state intervened in marriages because a broken home threatened the local economy and the social order. Today, the state still maintains a vested interest in the dissolution of a marriage, not out of moral judgment, but out of a desire to prevent citizens from becoming dependent on public resources. The alimony and child support formulas we use today are simply digitized versions of the separation allowances drafted by colonial governors who were terrified of a rising tax burden. When a judge in 2026 calculates a monthly payment, they are using a framework that prioritizes the same economic stability that the 1661 magistrates sought when they seized Benjamin's fishing boat to provide for Catherine. Consider a modern case study involving a character named Jordan in 2026. Jordan is navigating a high-asset divorce. While the language has shifted to equitable distribution and no-fault grounds, Jordan is still wrestling with the ghost of coverture. The way we view commingled assets, property that was once separate but became joint through the marriage, is a direct evolution of the 1661 debates over dowries and land titles. We still struggle with the idea of where one person's identity ends and the marital unit begins. The legal battle Jordan faces over a retirement account or a primary residence, a sophisticated, high-tech version of a 17th-century farmer arguing over the ownership of a plow or a specific acreage of tobacco. Historical trends show us that the American solution to domestic conflict has always been a move toward procedural efficiency. In 1661, this meant shifting from moral trials to financial settlements. In 2026, this means moving from courtrooms to mediation and collaborative law. We have traded the public shaming of the town square for the private confidentiality of a lawyer's office. But the underlying mechanism remains a negotiation of freedom. We have reached a point where the right to exit is nearly absolute, yet the cost of that exit is still managed by the state. This is the paradox of the 1661 legacy. You are free to leave, but you are rarely free from the financial obligations the state imposes to ensure your departure doesn't cost the community a cent. Imagine if you could explain our modern system to a colonist from 1661. They would be shocked by our no-fault laws, which allow a person to leave a marriage simply because they are no longer happy. They would find the idea of irreconcilable differences to be a radical, almost dangerous level of personal liberty. However, they would recognize our child support enforcement and our asset division perfectly. They would see that while we have liberated the heart, we have tightened the leash on the wallet. They would recognize that we still use the law to create a paper trail that follows an individual for the rest of their life, ensuring that a past union continues to influence their future financial standing. The 1661 legacy also lives on in the geographic divide of American law. Just as the frontier offered a different kind of justice than the coastal cities, we see today that your divorce experience varies wildly depending on which state line you cross. Some states maintain more traditional views on alimony that mirror the permanent maintenance of the 1660s, while others have moved toward rehabilitative support that emphasizes a clean, temporary break. This patchwork of laws is the modern version of the competing ideologies between the Puritan North and the Anglican South. We are still a nation of different domestic experiments, all trying to answer the same question: how much should a mistake in the past cost you in the future? Furthermore, we must address the social death we discussed in Part 3. While being a divorcee in 2026 doesn't result in a public whipping or being warned out of town, a subtle form of social and economic marginalization persists. Historical trends and data suggest that women, in particular, still face a significant drop in their standard of living following a divorce, mirroring the struggles of the 17th century women who lost their credit when they lost their husbands. We have replaced the branding iron with the credit score, but the result can be just as exclusionary. The 1661 system taught us that marriage is the primary engine of wealth accumulation in America, and leaving that engine remains the single greatest financial risk an individual can take. Step by step, we have traced the evolution from a world where you had to prove your spouse was a monster to get a separation, to a world where you can file for divorce on an app. Yet, the 1661 pivot reminds us that every gain in personal autonomy has been met with a new form of state surveillance. We are the most documented, tracked, and audited population in human history when it comes to our domestic lives. Your 2026 tax return, your health insurance status, and your Social Security benefits are all tethered to your marital history. The state has traded the moral police for the bureaucratic algorithm, but the goal remains the same: the management of the population through the unit of the family. In this deep dive masterclass, we have deconstructed the year 1661 to show you that your current reality was not inevitable. It was a series of choices, compromises, and rebellions made by people who were just as desperate, hopeful, and flawed as we are today. The 1661 laws failed because they ignored human empathy, and our modern laws succeed only to the extent that they balance the cold needs of the state with the genuine need for human beginning. You now understand the invisible strings. You see the paper trail of blood, the frontier renegades, and the theological pivots that built the room you are standing in. As we close this final chapter on the cultural history of divorce in America, one question remains for the future. If the history of the last 365 years has been a steady march toward individualization and the dismantling of the 1661 cages, what is the next step? Are we moving toward a world where the state exits the marriage business entirely? Or are we entering a new era of digital coverture where our data and our domestic lives are more intertwined than ever before? The story of 1661 isn't over. It's just changing its medium. In our next series, we are going to look at the rise of the digital household and how the 2020s are creating a new kind of legal identity that would make the 1661 magistrates look like amateurs. We will explore the frontier of the metaverse, the new paper trails of blockchain, and why your digital assets might be the next great battleground in the history of the American split. The loop is closing on the past, but it is opening wide on a future that is being written in code as we speak.